will start. I guess I was going to say, I think often there's this like divide. I mean, the coast is a divide between our realms, but I think when it comes to acoustic ecology and these questions that we really need to learn from each other. And so I'm excited to share, especially with the terrestrial ecologists who maybe haven't been aware of some of our challenges. I'm talking about a lot of challenges today. So there we go. So you'll note from my title that we're going to be talking about shrimp today. And what you hear now that is louder than me probably is the noise over a shrimp bed. Snapping shrimp in particular, which are one of the noisiest biological sound producers in all of the world. And I'm going to start by putting this more in context, but we're going to get to what I consider one of the most captivating noise producers, and something that has really sent me down what I call a shrimp hole for over a decade. So I didn't start as a soundscape ecologist. I actually was mostly a benthic ecologist very broadly. So I studied in seafloor communities and larval ecology. And of course, when we think about some of these marine benthic communities, such as a coral reef or an oyster reef, there's a lot of different ecological processes that drive the community dynamics. And also, of course, in underwater, we have certain environmental drivers, currents, temperature, depth, light, etc. But my focus is really on larval dispersal and settlement. So most of the animals that create these biogenic habitats, such as reefs, start their lives as larvae and settle into the seafloor. And one of the potential cues when I was starting my PhD that was coming to light was sound. And so I wanted to study the soundscape from that perspective. Turns out once you start listening to the undersea environment, or probably, as most of you know, once you start listening at all, you're like, it's just amazing and incredible how much all of this is immersed in an acoustic environment and the soundscape, and really how much soundscapes both influence ecological processes and reflect community dynamics. And so that's what kind of sent me into some things that in studying the soundscape and soundscape ecology that weren't really my focus of larval ecology, but have been really gratifying and I think pretty important in the field. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with marine soundscapes, I wanted to go through some of the different components. Just like on land, we have geophysical inputs from storms, rain waves, geological activity, ice calving, depending on where you are. And then, of course, unfortunately, I'd say humans are rivaling shrimp for their inputs into the marine environment with shipping, boat noise, construction of all sorts. And then, of course, at least for me, my favorite types of sounds and part of the soundscape is the biological components, which can be produced intentionally and also as the byproduct of animal activity. You can listen to marine sounds at a few different websites, and of course Google can help you, but I recommend datasets.org and fishsounds.net. I'll be playing a few during this talk, but there's a lot more, and hopefully more and more coming as we work towards increasing these libraries. So you're probably familiar with traditional bioacoustics in the marine realm being pretty marine mammal focused and about marine mammal communication. And there were also, maybe over the last 100 years or so, a lot of military and sonar and industrial applications. But for us ecologists, I'd say passive acoustic monitoring, or PAM, was historically limited by technology and logistics of being able to place sensors underwater and collect data and collect the sensors and get them back and all of this. But more recently, with the advent of different technologies and a lower barrier to entry. There's quite a bit of interest in PAM as a tool for both biodiversity monitoring and conservation. We've seen this a ton in the terrestrial realm, but now, especially for nearshore habitats that we can reach, and particularly popular recently for coral reefs, we are seeing a lot of interest in this. And so the dream for this, ecoacoustics for coral reef monitoring, and this applies to many habitats. I'm just going to focus on coral reefs a bit today because that's one of the more biodiverse places where we're seeing a lot of the challenges I'm going to talk about, and also it's one of the systems I work in. So as we know, we would love to be able to take our audio recordings and monitor things like reef health, fish diversity, mammals, boat noise, you name it. And we'd especially love to use things like the audio moth, which becomes a hydro moth if we put it in a underwater case, and easily deploy them, put them everywhere, and be able to better understand things that we cannot understand through visual surveys, which is a lot underwater, especially. And so over the past 10 years or so, there's really been a rapid increase in soundscape monitoring. And this is just a selection of some of the papers or titles that have come out looking at how we can use coral reef soundscapes and link them to ecosystem health, biodiversity, variation in these things across different reefscapes. And of course, there's been a lot of really nice work in the last few years for enhancing automated analyses and applying acoustic indicators. So how exactly do these soundscapes vary? I'm just going to show a couple of examples from my own work, but early on, when this kind of started maybe 10 to 15 years ago, there were plenty of examples of where sound levels and frequency content and acoustic complexity was higher on higher diversity reefs. And you can just see in these pictures an example of a study I did actually more related to larval settlement, but looking at how the soundscape of different quality of environment affected these acoustic characteristics. And this is handpicked, but I'll play you a sound that's pretty typical of a healthier reef. It's just 10 seconds or so. Oh, yeah. Some of those are fish sounds, and our friends the snapping shrimp are in the background as usual. But this is pretty typical that you'd hear some fish and shrimp, and then, you know, from our quantitative analysis, actually find that there's a lot more sound in fish-related frequencies and higher levels of snapping compared to a low coral cover rubbly area, which still has these snapping shrimps, but less so, and we don't see very many fish. So you can kind of imagine. But as we were able to start collecting more and more data, as usual, the story gets more complex. And I found in my work that there's extremely high small-scale spatial and temporal variation, which was really important to me as someone who's looking at this as a cue for animals navigating in the reefscape, but it also creates a problem for ecoacoustic monitoring or just passive acoustic monitoring, because we need to be careful about where we place our hydrophones to represent an entire reef or, you know, entire habitat. So here I show a map of a reef that I recorded using a drifting hydrophone, where across the reef we see over a few meters scale that we can have differences of up to 15 decibels in sound level. And that's really driven by these organisms that are clustered in the environment. And then often if I did a depth profile, so we've got this, you know, depth axis in the ocean that becomes important when we're thinking about shallow water sound propagation, and creates a real challenge because this figure shows a time series of hydrophones that are within a few meters of each other on a mooring, and actually have, at times 10 to 15 decibels different sound levels, and also different frequency, content, and power spectra than we would necessarily expect. And often, this would happen and we can't really explain it. And part of that's because we often have unknown biological sound sources. So this is just an example from a recent article by colleagues in the South Pacific, who were looking at the ability to monitor coral reef restoration using soundscapes, and they found it was detectable, and they could detect more fish calls, but in general, nobody knows which fish they are. They could be coming from the same fish. These are an example of 10 different calls that weren't that they used as their main metrics, but really don't know what types of fish they're coming from at all. So I just want to point out that there's over 35,000 fish species and approximately 1,000 validated sounds or less. And that does encompass a lot of the families, and it's clear that most fish are likely to be soniferous, but we really don't know who is who. And then, of course, there's even more marine invertebrate biodiversity, and probably fewer of them are soniferous, but a lot of them would be creating sounds either passively or actively, and we only have 100 validated sounds so far. And a lot of that is from a single extremely diverse family, which is a topic of my research that I'm going to talk about today. So this is just trying to give you a sense of the kind of scope of some of the challenges in applying terrestrial type ecoacoustic indices to marine soundscapes, and also just in using our soundscape ecology techniques in marine environments. And so these are 3 papers that came out within the last year and a half, I believe, that were all reviews that really highlighted the lack of standardized data collection and analysis. And based on the brief examples I showed you, you can imagine that, if there's no standardized data collection, we're really suffering in this field because of how much variation there can be if people are using different amounts of data, and often it's short samples and not very much spatial coverage. And so this has really influenced the lack of acoustic indices that are robust and applicable across environments and across regions. And today I'm more focused on things that underpin all of that, which is this lack of validation or characterization of the sounds themselves. And I've only really started, I wouldn't say started caring about it, but started deciding that I could help do something about it in terms of characterizing fish sounds. And part of that's, like Ben said, there's greater ability for us to do this with the technology that now exists, and community-based technology as well. And for a long time, it's really captured my attention that we have such a limited understanding of the drivers of sound production for these acoustically dominant species, and that I like to say a lot of the foundational basic ecology and bioacoustics knowledge is still needed to establish the use of PAM. So while the technology has been increasingly improving, and computer based algorithms and machine learning and all of that has really improved, that's great. And in parallel, some of us, including me, have been focusing on just trying to get more of those species validated or understand what it all means. So here's our shrimp again. And I've already told you what's making all of this racket, but it really is incredible. And that's So now I'm going to talk, for maybe 10, 15 minutes, just about the curious case of the snapping shrimp and explain to you some of the findings that I've had, and also like why I think that these critters are so important for us to better understand if we want to work with marine soundscapes. So this is just 2 of the 600 or so species of shrimp that exist that are known to produce this snapping sound. So this map I made, I've updated from the 1948 paper that I started this talk with. The quote that was, "The bedlam of crackling over a shrimp bed is never ending." And this is where those shrimp beds exist. And snapping shrimp dominate coastal soundscapes worldwide in water sometimes down to 50 meters, usually shallower than that, and certainly concentrated in warmer waters. But there's always interesting examples. For instance, there's a loch in Ireland that has been reported to have snapping shrimp. So they're very prolific and very loud. I want to give a brief history of how snapping shrimp were discovered as the culprit of that crackling sound that you have heard. It was for a long time an underwater sound mystery, quote unquote, while seafarers and people who went to sea, mariners, would report a strange crackling. They usually described it as the sizzling of frying fat or a crackling or, strange things. And more recently, I asked people what they think it sounds like, and it definitely reflects the time, because I get pop rocks. Some people say it's like sizzling popcorn in oil, but come up with your own description. It's definitely unique. So a lot of the explanations that were put forth at that time, and these are quotes from historical documents, were static crashes, rolling pebbles, shipworms, which would have been quite alarming, I would think. And it wasn't really until this one, the suspicious wartime activity, that scientists at least got down to business and confirmed what was making the sound, which was in fact not suspicious wartime activity, but these snapping shrimp. And so in 1942, the University of California Division of War Research linked the sound to the cryptic crustaceans known as snapping shrimp or pistol shrimp. That's also another common name. And actually here in South Africa, where I am, they are known as cracker shrimp. So those are the 3 common names I have heard, but they're part of the Alphiid family. And so they produced this very beautifully graphically designed report on the underwater noise caused by snapping shrimp. And one of the main things they studied was how fast the different vessels could go and still be undetectable because of the masking of the shrimp sound. So that was kind of their main focus. And they did describe they did describe some of the patterns, but it was very focused on like, how can we use this for military applications? So how loud is a shrimp snap actually? Well, it's been measured up to 210 decibels, and this is only narrowly beat out by the sperm whale click, which is known underwater to be the loudest biological sound. But as you can imagine, they are individually extremely loud. Luckily, it's only for a very small fraction of a millisecond that each snap occurs. So it isn't painful to listen to. I find it actually relaxing now. How exactly do they do it? This was also a very interesting part of the history, which was not actually discovered how the snapping mechanism worked. It wasn't until the late 1990s with the advent of high-speed videography. And I'm going to show a short video from that paper, which you can find online, and I recommend watching the whole thing, but you can see they're tickling this shrimp with a paintbrush, and then by slowing it down, they found that the snap is actually produced by cavitation bubbles. So you can see here that this claw, highly specialized one snapper claw, closes so quickly that a water jet is pushed out, and the change in pressure is so great that it implodes and basically causes a burst of light that we can't see in this, but we can see the collapse, and we can certainly hear it, and it's quite audible. So really interesting stuff. And these early observations did look at some time series of how the snapping actually varied in the environment. And even though it was based on limited data, they found some crepuscular activity in these sites that were all part of the war recording effort, and basically reported that there was no appreciable seasonality and just a slight increase in the snapping derived sounds overnight. But during my PhD, one of the main things I did once I became so captivated by this sound and how little we really knew about it was to develop a snap detector so that we could process and count snaps in large data sets. And by doing this, we found that even with single sites, and that's what I'm showing here is a time series from a single site and a single hydrophone over different parts of the year, that there were actually extremely strong dial patterns, and sometimes almost 2,000 snaps per minute at the peak, and that these would shift depending on the time of year. And so this wasn't as easy to explain ecologically that, okay, they're nocturnal creatures, this is, when they're active. There's all this snap going on and weak snapping going on, and we really still don't know much about what it's all about. I also, at that point, started recording in coral reef environments where there's a lot higher diversity of snapping shrimp, and found that nearby sites, separated by a few hundred meters, could have opposite or very different daily patterns in their snapping. And so I started thinking, if we could figure out what this means, then it might be useful as part of this soundscape metrics or ecoacoustic indices. But then, I'd go somewhere else and find daytime dominance. So we have in the US Virgin Islands, in the Caribbean, where I've done quite a bit of work, these shrimp do opposite from shrimp elsewhere, and I don't really know what it means. So these are just kind of examples of why I find the shrimp a really important part of especially coral reef ecoacoustic monitoring, and something that's fairly overlooked. We have linked a lot of the patterns to physical variables, but not in a satisfying way to be able to apply them. So I did spend a couple of years as a postdoc doing lab investigations of the drivers of snapping patterns, but for just two species that are quite common through the Western Atlantic Ocean. You can see that here, Alpheus heterocalis, and can see one here in this little video on the right, snapping. So this video is showing them snapping during aggressive encounters, which is quite common, but they definitely are snappy for more than just when they're in groups. One of the things that I wanted to study was how these snap rates might be influenced by the social context, since we know that this is happening all the time. It didn't seem very likely, even though it was widely reported at that time that the snapping was mostly just for territorial interactions. But I did find that each day. Shrimp on their own would still snap, whether that's just for fun or exercise, or a communication signal has yet to be firmly established, but they are snapping under different social contexts, at least in these species. And it's really influenced by temperature and time of day. So this top panel shows the results of an experiment that I conducted, looking at how temperature influenced and interacted with different groupings of shrimp and their snap production. And then this lower graph shows some of the daily patterns of different types of pairs. So kind of getting more of that bioacoustics background of, okay, what is causing these signals to occur? And since temperature was such a clear influence, I have spent a lot of time looking back at field data, and that's shown here, where we see that especially in places with more seasonality or changes in the temperature, there's really clear influence of temperature on the overall soundscape, but via this relationship with the snap rates. So there's implications for soundscapes and soundscape dependent processes in warming environments, not only because these shrimp, their range is likely expanding, but they are also potentially getting more or producing more sound when it's warmer, and shifting when they produce sound. So thought a lot about these shrimp and how we could use snap rates and snapping derived or metrics that include snapping as an indicator of the goals. That dream of ecoacoustic monitoring in coral reefs is to be able to look at habitat health or reef recovery and biodiversity, and people have used snap rate, but most of my work has shown that it's very complex. So I show this not so shrimpable slide to really highlight the fact that I've spent more time with these types of shrimp than most people in the world, even the few, well, maybe not Arthur Anker, who goes around and discovers new species of these shrimp all the time, probably more, but in terms of thinking and trying to understand their snapping behavior, there hasn't really been that much or a ton of work, and each coral reef might have 100 species living on it. So the soundscape patterns are extremely complex, and I'm on a mission to keep on listening to shrimp and learning more about what their snapping might tell us about the environment. One of the things I wanted to point out for those of you who aren't familiar with this species complex is that they have a ton of diversity in their symbioses. So a lot of them live with gobies symbiotically. Some live with shrimp, some live with anemones. They live in eusocial colonies within sponges. And so it's likely that in a sponge-dominated benthic environment that there would be much different snapping shrimp patterns than in a rocky bottom, but I'm still working on it and hoping for more people to be working on this as well. So this kind of brings me back to this current challenges and limitations slide. And I've highlighted here that I think a lot of my work, I hope, demonstrates how our limited understanding of the drivers of sound production really feeds into our absence of robust indicators or indices. And this is not just the shrimp. This is just one example of a dominant species in so many marine habitats that we really, or an acoustically dominant species that is mostly overlooked, or people are trying to get rid of this sound, but it could be telling us a lot more. So this is some of the foundational work that I hope to continue to do and that others will join me in. And this map just shows that part of my current mission is to explore snapping variation around the world. And I have colleagues that I'm working with to do so and providing data. But these are places where I myself have been recording and analyzing, counting the snap rates and trying to understand it better. And so I'm hoping I'll have more answers for you in some upcoming papers and my next presentation. But it's definitely ongoing work and probably career long. So the next thing I want to talk about and kind of round out my talk is, as I mentioned, something I've gotten into more recently, kind of compelled by this, like, okay, I started out thinking we could holistically, do soundscape monitoring and treat fish sound maybe as just this bandwidth, then use a diversity index. But as I've delved into it, it seems pretty clear that we need better characterization of fish and invertebrate sounds. But a lot of reviews recently, as they say, are really, we all agree we need to do better and improve our libraries and characterization of sounds as it relates to all of these other challenges, and really underpins the work that we want to do in terms of conservation and restoration monitoring in a lot of the places that I work. So I think I mentioned before that there's 35,000 species of fish, and many, many, many more invertebrates, and only or less than 4% have been examined for sound production. And at least for marine fish, there's an assumption that most of them probably do produce sound. And so you'll see, if you look at these great reviews that have recently come out, that we really know that it's important to understand sound production in fish more, because they're so well distributed. There would be such a good indicator for a lot of these places, and have ecological functions we could understand much better through acoustic monitoring, but we just don't know who is who. So why is this? If you don't work in the sea, you might not have thought as much about this problem, though the first problem is common with a lot of cryptic species, but we have underwater so many species that live within complex habitat. We also have a lot of fish that are nocturnal, especially sound producing ones, or are scared, or we aren't really getting to see. Visual validation is extremely hard underwater. Even using a camera system, it is limited to a few meters typically, depending on where you are and the visibility. Requires really full 360 degrees to know who is who. And then at night, obviously that's even harder. And then propagation conditions vary a lot. So I mentioned that before when I just described how we get weird things happening in our recordings that you don't expect, is because the benthic bathymetry, or changes in rugosity, and all of the seafloor and seabed really affects propagation, especially in shallow water. And that means that we might actually have, a recording from a fish in one type of environment, but because we don't have them recorded in a lot of different environments, and these libraries are really small, sometimes we can't confirm what is making a sound. And I know there's some people on the call, like you, Jill, who knows this very, very well and has been trying to validate them. And then lastly, and something that has really occurred to me as someone who just wants to observe and understand the behaviors that are relating to these sounds, observers interfere and generate a lot of noise. So underwater, we are typically pretty noisy when we are there. So how can we identify and characterize reef sound sources, and then improve our sound libraries and ultimately the ecoacoustic metrics and analytical abilities? historically, a lot of what we already have is done through captive recordings, and this certainly still has a place and is necessary because it isolates fish that often live in groups with high diversity of sound producers, and so it can be extremely difficult to know which fish is making which sound, especially on coral reefs that might have thousands of fish. So this is important, though, of course, behavior is potentially interfered with, or you're not encompassing all of the range of natural behaviors when you have them in a tank, and also the acoustics are affected through reflections. But it's one piece of the puzzle, and I put here a few of the groups. There's a Belgian scientist, Xavier, who recently did a talk on this seminar series, and he's put out a lot of great work recently on these, on tanks, and CREOB is a French Polynesian research institute where a lot of, or at least like a handful of studies have been done, which is more than for a lot of different reefs. So what else can we do? And this is where Xavier Mui, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, he can tell us after because he's here, has developed in situ video audio technology, and recently published a couple of papers which are really exciting because they also give open access information on how to build these both stationary and mobile arrays. And so these are arrays of hydrophones combined with cameras that can then detect or give you directional information on which fish or invertebrate or whatever sound producer is making the sound that you detect. Of course, as I mentioned in the last slide, this is always going to be limited by visual detection and require some sort of different lighting at night, and has its place, but still, every bit counts. And that's sort of, I guess, my point now, and what I'll get to in a second. We've also got Mark on the call, who is working with Cornell and his company Fisheye Acoustics to develop this type of technology. And I'm not as familiar, or haven't seen exactly what it is, but I know that will also revolutionize the use of this underwater. So it's very exciting. And then lastly, I really think that complementary to both of these is diver observations. Has its limitations in terms of interference, but with CCR, which is closed circuit rebreather diving, and also free diver observations, there's the opportunity to adaptively sample. So I think it really complements both the mobile type arrays and also stationary arrays, which can tell us a lot. But this is where myself and my organization has kind of started with interviews with fish, which I fully admit I'm really new to, and that's why I've been in touch with some of the people who are have been doing this a lot longer than me. But I'm excited at the prospect of community-based involvement, or involving people who already are underwater doing this type of work to collect observations, especially towards the challenge that I was talking about with needing repeated or records of certain species from multiple places in different environmental conditions in different regions of the world. I think that this is a really good resource, especially as the technology increases to record them, but also to store them and have these repositories. So many of our colleagues are working on the global library of underwater biological sound, and other ones like fish sound databases, which I know Audrey is the one who's been heading that, and it's really great. So I'm really excited about being able to contribute, even though I would not call, I'm not a fish bioacoustician, but I like to listen and interview fish underwater. So I'm going to keep doing that. And I'm wrapping up now, but I want to show you why closed circuit rebreathers are helpful, because this is something that I've recently taken on as like kind of a personal challenge is to learn this type of diving, which is it's a technical diving field, and it's more dangerous, usually used for going deep, but I would argue that is really important for fish behaviorists and fish bioacousticians, and has been argued before. I think there was a paper by Phil Lobel in the 90s saying like we should be using rebreathers to study fish, but hasn't really been taken up. And I want to say that I've seen firsthand how different it is and how much more we can observe. So regular scuba here. I'm going to make rebreather diving, which is a closed loop that you're not producing those bubbles, a disturbance as well as the sound. And I'll say, just even anecdotally, from starting doing my work using a rebreather, that I see a ton more for it to be quiet. And so I highly recommend it. Of course, there's also free diving and what I like to call fish spy cams, which mine aren't as advanced yet as Mark and Xavier's, but even with that, I'm really, able to see a lot more than we normally do. So I want to highlight here before I end that, as part of this, how can we identify and characterize reef sound sources? I actually think you don't have to be, at least to record them. We don't need everyone to be a bioacoustician or know about it, but to be there and be quiet or be a hobbyist. So I'm working to involve more communities in general in ecoacoustic monitoring by using hydromoths and training them, but also, like a GoPro, if you're underwater and somewhere with fish, especially if they're isolated, I've gotten some of my best fish sound recordings from this type of work through free diving. So I think I'm gonna, before I wrap or end completely, I want to show a video I recently took off of the east coast of Tanzania in Zanzibar. And I came across these fish, and now I have a record of their sound. And it works a lot better in places that are unfortunately degraded, because I can usually find fish by themselves. But you can see here, I've quickly put together a spectrogram and can say, okay, banded humpback. And, then I can look online and see that somebody else has also, like, these fish are common and they have been recorded. But in my opinion, more recordings, the better, in different places, in different conditions, and we can bring all of these together with those databases that I mentioned. So that's the end of my talk. I know it was a lot of different stuff, and it was a lot of things from different years. So these are a bunch of collaborators on all of this work. You can check out my website, or we have 2 Instagram accounts where we share a lot of our work and do kind of just education on ecoacoustics and just interesting things in general. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Ashlee. Looks like we have one from Amaris. So she is wondering how these sounds are being produced. Is it by air breathing mechanisms, or the way the fish swims? Or what's the mechanism for sound production in these fish?
I like to say always both, but yeah, I mean, I didn't really get into intentional, like active sounds versus passive sounds. There can be schooling sounds, but most of the sounds that I'm talking about or trying to characterize are actively produced through the swim bladder and what we call sonic muscles or pharyngeal teeth in the back or in fish mouth, I guess. I'm not a fish biologist, so anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a variety of mechanisms to produce drumming, grunting, sounds like that are kind of pulsing farts. Let me see if, well, so you heard the humbug, but this is a video that kind of is an example. There's fish sounds going on, but the parrotfish is eating, and you can hear fishy sounds. So that's, you know, the byproduct of its activity. Other fish, especially our damselfish that are very territorial, are producing sounds using the swim bladder and sonic muscles. So that's a really good question.
Julia, looks like you have a question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I'm working in Norway with passive acoustic monitoring, and we also tried some audio modes underwater. And I was wondering how happy you are with your recordings, because we tried them, but I also tried them while freediving actually, and I got some sound, so it was quite fun. But we also work with cold coral reefs, and they are very deep, right? Like they start at 60 meters. And I got, I think, a lot of self noise from these audio mods. So I was wondering, like, how often you are working with it and if it's working well or.
It's a good question and an important one for using the technology. I've really started maybe in the last year using them, and I still use a more conventional hydrophone as well. And I'm finding a lot of variation. So, and I think I'm sure there's a paper by Tim Lamont, maybe Ben Williams, that showed the effectiveness of audio moths as hydro moths. And I think they found similar amounts of variation. So the caveat is, you know, how do we use these tools that are uncalibrated and have a lot of variability between them? And I think it is that we do more presence absence, at least to begin with. And I think I can still count snap rates and certain fish sound rates, but it's certainly not as effective in certain and kind of like acoustic metrics that we might want to apply. So that's kind of my answer. I've been, I guess, medium happy that they can record sounds, but I think that there's a lot of limitations as well. So that's kind of the trade-off. And so when I'm designing projects now with community conservation groups, I'm trying to balance, you know, having one or two higher quality, more expensive acoustic recorders or hydrophone, at least to begin with, and try to get a sense of that variability. So hopefully that helps, but happy to discuss more.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions for Ashlee? Hey, Patrick.
Hey, how's it going? Hi, Ashlee. How's it going? Loved your talk.
Thanks. Hi, Patrick. I can't see you. Oh,
Oop.
he is. Hi, Patrick. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. So, Ashlee, I've always been interested in your findings looking at temporal variation in snap rates. Sometimes it peaks during the day, sometimes it peaks at night, and I've always been interested in whether or not that was closely related to the agonistic behavior that you showed in those little enclosures. And I was wondering if you've ever seen like the actual snapping behavior on the reef and whether or not that would change with like tidal flow when there's an outgoing tide and they're trying to spawn. Are they snapping at each other to try and get like primo habitat to maximize their like spawning ability, I guess, or something? I'm not sure. But I've always wondered, what was really behind that kind of variation.
Yeah, me too. No, I think those are all like good suggestions and hypotheses, and my answer is now kind of always both or always everything, and this is part of the difficulty in teasing it all apart. And
Yeah.
that's basically why I started with the more subtropical places where there's fewer species, and now I think, well, but I need to I'm working in places with lots and lots of species, and you rarely see them, right?
Yeah.
But I have some, ideas of kind of the shrimp farm, like ant farm style tanks to be able to do this, or like tiny cameras. I mean, I'm open to all of these suggestions. Unfortunately, no one really has wanted to pay me to just study shrimp, but I'm open and looking for patrons who want to know all of these things. So I think that's why it's like a lifelong dream of mine, is to get to know them better. But like you, I have all of these ideas because sometimes in some places there's really strong tidal influence on the shrimp, and then other places. So I've had all sorts of ideas of like, well, maybe when they're juveniles, there's different diel variability and who's snapping when during mating season, but we don't know when that happens.
Right.
We don't know the basic ecology of these species, never mind the 600 of them. So maybe maybe that's daunting to everyone who thinks I should just give up, but I'm going to to keep doing some of this. But
No, I love it. Yeah, I've always
fun.
wanted to put like a little tiny camera on like the backs of one of them and just be like, okay, what are you doing? Like, come on, we have to know why you're changing from the rest of your family. So anyway,
And there's
thanks.
some anecdotal evidence too. I guess I'll say I only mentioned this briefly, but the ones that live in shrimps live in these eusocial colonies. So they're the only example of a marine organism that is eusocial. And those ones have basically, very anecdotally, I know one report that just kind of mentions that when one shrimp started snapping on one side of a sponge, then they started snapping on the other. But it's very much just one person's observation. So we get fascinating.
Thanks, Ashlee.
Hey, Julia.
Yes, I have a second question if nobody else wants to ask. Also about shrimps and snapping shrimps, because it was during my master thesis, I had some sounds from this time very good hydrophones along a fjord and on the coast. And I had this crackling sound. And when I look on the web, I was okay, maybe it's snapping shrimp, but it turned out like there are known snapping shrimps in Norway, or not supposed to be. So do you have any idea of if other type of shrimps could produce this kind of crackling noise, or like what it could be, or if it's possible to find some in higher latitude? Or
I would never say it's impossible. However, we can't say for sure that every snap that I even count, there might once in a while be something else that's getting counted. Stomatopods or mantis shrimp are known to make similar impulsive sounds in certain circumstances. I would argue that they're not known to make them as frequently, or like so much activity. So that's something to look in. And then there's a worm that apparently has a similar stereotype signal, and I can send you the paper on that. I shared that with Rodney Roundtree recently, because he said he had written asking about shrimp in freshwater, and as far as I know, there's only one freshwater, but he was getting this sound that was similar, and I suggested it might be a worm that can do it. So I'll share that with you if you want to email me. But those things, and then I would say, I'd be surprised if there's benthic sampling there that no one has ever found a snapping shrimp, but and then it is snapping shrimp, but I don't know. I mean, the range has expanded, and in the United Kingdom, there's apparently a shrimp, but I've heard other people have told me similar things, and I can't say for sure. But officially, there's no reports or record of an Alpheid shrimp there.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that. Intriguing.
Yes, I will mail you to ask some more information.
Yeah.
Ashlee, are you good taking a few more questions? I realize we're a couple minutes past our normal closing time, but we have one from Melina.
Yeah.
About,
I mean, jump off if they're done, but I can stay.
okay, great. So how do you distinguish the sounds of different organisms in the reef soundscape? For example, have you ever been able to identify any sounds coming from corals?
So your question, Melina, kind of hits right on, kind of like what we're trying to do is distinguish the different sounds by ground truthing and confirming which sounds come from different organisms. And I guess I should have, there's just so much to tell you all about the shrimp, but the shrimp I didn't mention, like, mostly live within coral skeletons and inside of other things. So that's why they're rarely seen. And so we certainly identify sounds coming from corals, but it's not the corals themselves. It's emanating out of the three-dimensional structure that corals produce. So I would suspect that corals themselves, while they could produce very small sounds through closing their polyps or all of that, I don't think it would be detectable in the soundscape or in our recordings, or I can't imagine, we can hardly at this point distinguish which fish is making which sound. So I don't know that would be possible, but there's lots of sounds coming from corals and from within the coral matrix, and that's kind of one of the challenges, especially with the invertebrates and fish. I mean, there's probably plenty of fish that we don't see that are producing sounds within. So it's a good question and something I was remiss in explaining. She says they seem very silent. I don't know if she means corals or coral reefs, but I think, well, I don't know if you're a scuba diver. Oh, the corals. Yes, I think the corals. Okay. Reefs are not very silent.
No. And there was a paper, I think like 2 years ago, from Freeman and Freeman about the sounds that are produced by algae on the reef.
Oh,
and,
okay.
Yeah, and so there's like a detectable mid-frequency signature of the algae as it photosynthesizes. It gives off these air bubbles that create this wash of noise during the daytime and not at night. And so maybe the corals are silent, but there's other aspects of coral reef structure that have some sonic signature to them.
And I guess I'll point out briefly that most people who study acoustics or bioacoustics realize this, but you don't have to be a sound producer to be affected by sound. And there's good evidence that the corals are probably affected by the soundscape in which that they're immersed. So silent but listening.
Ashlee, I was wondering about your Sound Ocean Science initiatives and these projects that you're starting in different regions. Like, how do those partnerships get started and nurtured? And then if like, I'm wondering what the community partners who you're working with, like what questions are they really interested in answering using acoustics? Is it very different depending on the place, or are there some common themes there? And yeah, any advice with regards to those sorts of that type of work?
And that kind of collaboration. Yeah, so how has it evolved? Well, I kind of went on a walkabout mission starting a couple years ago, to places that probably haven't, or less represented in ecoacoustic monitoring in nearshore shallow water environments, but also have a lot of community-based NGOs and conservation organizations. And I had worked for a few years after postdoc for the Nature Conservancy and in direct conservation, and really saw how much, like, you know, we do a lot of work in academia that is conservation science, but rarely, like, it's really true that it's not accessible and applicable often. And so I thought, you know, one of the ways I can be a facilitator is by having a foot in both of those. So I really just like go and meet people that I want to meet. And I have been kind of nomadic, and then narrowed it down to people I think I can make a contribution to and they're interested. And so, you know, really it's like contacting organizations, and they want this, and sometimes they have budget for it, sometimes they don't, you know, we can work together on that. And then in terms of their questions, I mean, a lot of them don't realize, or they've heard that they're excited because they've heard, maybe they go, especially in coral reefs, you know, there's been murmurings of this like passive acoustic monitoring, and how they see in the media even like, oh, this restoration project used sound or can do that. So they're quite interested, and I, like I did today, I really try to like set the expectations low, that it's very exploratory. We're still, you know, by doing this work across different regions, establishing baselines or like understanding. And so they're usually excited just about that, without, you know, the expectation that they can answer questions right away, because a lot of it is just then education on things like noise pollution, or they do want to know, they're like, oh, can we monitor some basic things? And luckily we can monitor like boat noise and things like this, and give those types of metrics. So I'd say that's kind of like the first level. And then yeah, it varies. Like I have a couple of partners, one that's very coral focused and marine protected area, and they'd love to have more data showing that their protected area is functional or working or different than outside. So easy to design those projects. Same with in Indonesia, I'm working with some reef restoration groups, and they're just excited to put audio moths or like have soundscapes. And again, for me, it's like, well, we don't know what the fish sounds are, so you can help even with that. And I like that. I think anyone with a GoPro can start kind of getting some information towards that.
Awesome. Ashik, I saw you had a question.
I think it will take longer time than we have, so I'll pass.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to, you know, hear from anyone who wants to talk about this stuff. I'm definitely working a lot now outside of, or like with colleagues, you know, interdisciplinary and not acousticians. So talking with people who are in the field in acoustics is awesome for me to get that too. So please reach out.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Ashlee, for today.
Pleasure, and I love sharing data too. So
Yeah, it's data and tools. Now I remember Ashlee shared her shrimp detector with me, and that really was a huge help during my PhD. So whether it's data or tools, please get in touch with Ashlee if you want to connect. And we'll be back in 2 weeks, this time focused on effects of anthropogenic noise on terrestrial wildlife with Yael Leonard. So should be another great talk. And thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Ben.
For sure. Bye-bye, Ashlee.